Okay, that's the opening statement by the state in the Jeremiah Monell case out of New Jersey. Let's break some of this down right now with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, great to see you.
Jesse, good morning.
Is this a hard case to prosecute?
No, I don't think it's a hard case to prosecute because we have an eyewitness who I think a jury is going to put a lot of stock in. It's the son of the defendant, old enough to be able to recount exactly what he saw. So it's not a very young child, old enough to be able to recount, and you're going to have, how can you not have a ton of sympathy for a 12-year-old boy who witnessed something as horrific as this?
Yeah, he's 14 years old now, testified yesterday, but my gosh, what is that like? Can you even imagine to be him?
No.
I'm not sure.
No, I can't imagine either. And you have to remember, this young boy must have had several conversations with the prosecution before this went to trial. He may be the reason why the prosecution offered a 30-year deal, because I can't imagine any other reason why they would.
You might be right. I mean, it was just horrifying to watch him recount this, just a traumatic, awful moment in his life. But we're not there yet. I want to now go to the defense's opening statement because they claim their client didn't do it. Take a look.
Some of you said you had children. And sometimes you'll ask your kid who left the cereal out. And that child responds to you with a whole lot of things rather than the answer to the question that was presented to them. So is it a response? Or is it just merely, or is it an answer? You're going to be left with more questions than answers. All the pieces won't neatly fit in the puzzle and give you the picture that the government just painted for you. And you'll be left with one choice only, and that is to find Jeremiah Monell not guilty of the murder of Tara O'Shea. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. We'll talk about that defense opening in a second, but before we do, I want to bring back in forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, can you walk us through the actual crime here, the actual stabbing? I mean, we were just talking about the Melanie Eam case. What is the, from your review of the evidence here, what was the manner of death? How exactly did Tara O'Shea Watson die? Okay,
if you look at the Eam case and you think about it in terms of numeric measurement, it's at about a 4. This is at about 10 plus. This fellow had placed this woman on the floor of their home, the estranged husband had, and stabbed her over and over and over and over again. This is a classic case of what is referred to specifically as overkill, and had just essentially ripped her to shreds, Jesse. And what makes it so compelling, as Joanna had mentioned just a moment ago, was the fact that this was done in the home where this child was, and witnessed the body being covered. And that's another important point of order here, that he felt compelled to cover the body, which is something that we see in these intimate cases where, this idea that they don't want the face of the person that they've killed looking back at them. This is referred to specifically as face covering. So this is a very brutal case.
Atrocious, and even more disturbing when you think about the 12-year-old son of now 14 years old who discovered the body. Before we get there, though, let's move on to the testimony of Detective Eric Crane from the New Jersey State Police. We'll learn a little bit more about the investigation. Take a look.
A victim, a human being, and to my recollection, I did observe blood stains on the blanket as well, but it was in place over top of the body.
What did you do in regards to the blanket itself?
Removed the blanket to ensure that it was, in fact, a human being underneath the blanket, and then placed it back, left it in place, I should say, where it was prior to being moved and collected later on.
The individual that you observed that was under the blanket, what, if anything, did you observe and note about that person's condition?
observed multiple blood stains on various regions of her body and multiple lacerating stab wounds to the neck, chest area.
And is that an accurate representation of the condition of Ms. O'Shea once the blanket would have been removed?
Yes, sir.
And are you the individual that actually took this photograph?
Yes, sir.
Upon completing your walk.
Okay, I want to take a step back, though, and talk about the defense's opening statement, Jonna. She said it would left more questions than answers. I'm not going to lie, I think I had a little bit more questions than answers from the defense's opening statement. What was your theory on that? What was your take on it?
Yeah, I was a little taken aback that she was actually comparing what the jury is going to hear in this case about a very horrific murder with a child who's lying about who moved the cereal box. You can't compare these apples and oranges. It's not the same. Now, I get that perhaps her defense for her client is going to be, well, you know, we're not exactly sure that my client committed this horrific murder. Maybe the boogeyman came in and did it instead, or somebody else is the one who stabbed her. He only choked her. Maybe that's what the defense is going to be. I don't find it very effective at this stage.
Those defenses, those opening statements where it's like, hey, keep an open mind, don't, you know, everybody's entitled to a defense, you know, you're innocent until proven guilty, those work. And I know we only have about 20 seconds.
You know, rarely. Juries want to sink their teeth into facts. We live in an age where we should have facts and forensics. And when you don't have that, or when you do have that, then the keep an open mind usually goes out the door.
Hey, listen, we saw it in the Melanie Eam case. The defense at least tried to point the finger at somebody else. It didn't work well for their client. And I'm not saying that this is what they should have done here, but it's interesting to see that dichotomy. So there's a lot more to talk about in the Jeremiah Monell case. Let's take a break. When we come back, a lot more to discuss. Stay tuned. Okay, how can we not talk about those knives? Joseph, we keep talking about these knives and how one of the most remarkable images was the bent knife. I mean, can you just walk us through this level of attack?
When you have, this is called a shored wound, when you have someone that is lying on a hard surface like this, it can apply to, say, for instance, someone that has been stabbed or shot. There's kind of a bracing that goes behind it, and it increases, it transfers the absorption of this energy. And that's why you're getting these bent knives like this. Right in the shank of the blade, it kind of bends to one side. It transfers all of this energy. There's a tremendous amount of power that's going forward. This is generated as a result of this anger and all this sort of thing, the adrenaline that's pumping. And so it goes to the brutality. You can see the detective holding that knife there and how upturned the blade is. And plus, they're super saturated with blood. This is, for a forensics person, this is a pot of gold, if you will, because this goes back to a theory that we refer to in forensics as individualization. That is that you can take the evidence, whether it be fingerprints or trace evidence, or in this case blood evidence, and tie it back to a specific individual. What I would be very curious, and what I've been curious about because of the brutality of this, the assailant, I'm wondering if he had any injuries as well, and this would go even further to attach him to the crime. So lots of times when you're examining these instrumentalities like these knives, you would look for what is referred to as a commingling of biological evidence. Say his blood might be on there as well as hers. You might also find trace samples of DNA that would put the weapon actually in his hand. Remember, he's not supposed to be there. So, you know, they have to answer why his trace elements are being found on these weapons.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You know, we're trying to piece together what happened that night. Really a brutal crime. One of the interesting pieces of testimony was from a paramedic who was actually the victim's neighbor. In case you haven't seen this testimony, you really should. Watch this.
Once he got inside, what happened after that?
He opened the front door, and that's when I entered the residence. I looked around and didn't see anything out of place. I looked down, and the only thing that caught my eye out of place was there was Sarah's comforter laying on the living room floor.
And what did you think once you saw that comforter?
From my past experiences, I didn't think anything good could come of it.
once you saw that blanket on the floor, the comforter on the floor, what did you then do?
I then went to the upper right-hand corner, raised it just enough to where I could look in. What I saw was Mcstay's head was turned to the right. I saw minimal blood spatter up the side of her cheek. Eyes wide open, mouth wide open. Skin was pale, cold to the touch. Went to move the jaw and it wouldn't move. I went to reach for a pulse in the carotid area, and my finger went into a gaping hole. I immediately pulled the blanket back, told Jimmy to exit the residence, and Jimmy had been looking over my shoulder. He was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher. He dropped me the phone, and he went and exited the residence as he came in. I told the dispatcher what we had. I asked for a BLS and ALS ambulance to respond to the scene to do a pronouncement. Also asked for the crime scene unit and told them I was securing the residence and declaring it a crime scene until they could get there.
Wow. Jonna, I want to talk to you now about where we are in this case. The evidence against the defendant, pretty strong. Yes. He had an opportunity for a 30-year plea deal. It's no sneeze, it's 30 years, but he didn't take it. Now he could be facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. What's going on here?
You know, I don't know if this defendant is actually delusional, Jesse, or perhaps is or was, maybe at the time of this offense, on some heavy-duty drugs. And I imagine, I'm willing to bet that his attorney probably tried very hard to twist his arm to take that 30-year deal, but in his mind, he doesn't think he's going to be found guilty. Plus, so he gets sentenced to life. Let's say at the end of this trial, he gets sentenced to life. He's going to file an appeal, so he might as well take his chances. As opposed to getting a guaranteed 30, take his chances that something is going to go wrong and he won't end up doing life in prison.
Anything going wrong so far for him?
Everything's going very right for the prosecution so far.
Especially, I mean, we're going to talk more about it, but having the son testify was one of the most incredible things I think I've ever seen. Compelling.
And the state of this body, and as our other guest Joe pointed out, this was so violent. He's bending knives when he's stabbing this woman 48 times. And I also think it's very compelling that the jury not only gets to see the state of the knife bent, but with the blood still on it. That is very impactful.
Listen, we are going to continue our coverage of this trial next week, but we wanted to just let you know what has been happening so far in this trial. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to switch gears and talk about the Mcstay family murder case out of California. We'll be right back. Come on, I'll be right back. Okay, let's break some of this down right now. Joseph, their bodies were found in 2 shallow graves in the Mojave Desert 3 years after they were killed. Can you walk us through just what is the difficulty in trying to process that kind of crime scene, trying to understand what happened to these bodies? I mean, can you explain that to us?
You know, I think the complexity of this case, Jesse, gives the investigators pause here because you've got several different, let's see, how can I put this? Secondary scenes that are kind of taking place. You have a primary scene, which is where the bodies are actually eventually found. But then the big question is, well, where did this initial attack take place? And what happened to the bodies in the interim? You know, we've heard about storage units. We've heard about the bodies being transported. And so every place that these bodies pass through creates an element of evidence. And this goes back to an old principle in forensic science that's referred to as Locard's exchange principle that states that every contact leaves a trace. And so we can see what's evidenced here, for instance, in this photograph. The desert is a very harsh environment, as everyone knows, the Mojave in particular. And so, counsel had mentioned how you had animal activity around the bones. But what really is kind of stark here and what really paints a picture is the destruction that we see to the heads, to the skulls, and the fact that there was a weapon that was found in the grave, which still to me makes no sense whatsoever, because that gives you connectivity. If anyone comes around these remains, they're going to know that that sledgehammer has significance in this particular case. So
yeah,
it's very, very complex.
Yeah, that sledgehammer being there at the scene was very questionable for me too. That one struck me as a little odd. But before we get there, let's now move on to the defense and see what is their defense. What are they saying? That their client is not guilty. Let's see.
What can we find? How can we look at this innocuous evidence and make it seem like he's guilty? That's what they did in San Bernardino. They predetermined he's the guy, and they didn't look at anything else. They stopped when they had other avenues to go. They didn't follow up. They didn't question witnesses that could have gave them information that pointed at other people. I'm going to go through some of the things that's problem with their arguments. The weird thing is about this bias is the investigators, I don't know if they did it intentionally, but when they submitted their reports to the district attorney's office, they were incorrect. The facts were misrepresentations to make it look worse. And they made it very clear nobody else was involved. Violent is important. Joseph Mcstay, multiple injuries to his skull from that 3-pound sledgehammer. Busting large craters into his skull, fracturing it multiple places. Very, very violent acts. Summer Mcstay, what they put together, they had multiple fractures. You can see also impacts on her skull. You can see the multiple fractures in her jaw. You can see some of the impact. It's hard to see here, but there are impacts on different pieces of the skull. She was struck multiple times. Gianni, he also had multiple impacts. Violent death for Gianni. Joseph, the autopsy is inconclusive. They don't know. That is all that's left. Or excuse me, Joseph Jr. That's all that's left of him. So they can't say if it was blunt force trauma. The assumption is, based on the circumstance, everybody else died. Unfortunately, Joseph Jr. died the same way. Why is this important?
There's no question this is a horrific crime. John, I guess the question is, who did this? And, you know, the prosecution's theory that Merritt did this for financial motives, the fact that he was apparently in debt and had a gambling problem, took advantage of the Mcstay's finances in order to help that issue, this greed. Does that hold water with you? What do you think of it?
Well, it provides a good motive, but as you know, motive isn't enough to convict. And what we have here, Jesse, is a quintessential circumstantial case, right? There's no eyewitness. The prosecution is tasked with piecing this together based on nothing but circumstance. Especially when you look at the condition of the bodies when they were finally found. There's nothing left to them. So in this case, it's almost as if reasonable doubt is built in, and the defense might have an easier time than the prosecution during the course of this trial.
Joseph and I were talking about the idea of the sledgehammer being there with the bodies. Mm-hmm. Seems strange, no?
Well, I mean, actually, no. What else are you going to do with it? Why not put the murder weapon in with the bodies? Because if they find the bodies, who cares if the murder weapon is inside the shallow grave?
Joseph made a good point about connectivity, though, and the question is if really who did this, right? And if you're trying to commit, I mean, burying them in the desert seems like the place. It's almost like throwing somebody in a large body of water, you know, the ocean or something like this. But to keep it there, I'm still trying to understand exactly how this happened. So, you know, that's the issue here. Is we're all trying to ask questions about how this ultimately happened. You know what we can do, though? In case you haven't seen it, I want to play the testimony of Susan Blake. This is Joseph Mcstay's mother. Now, this is only going to be audio, but it's very important in case you haven't seen it. Take a look.
Telling the detectives that when you spoke to Mike, he indicated to you that Dan Cavanaugh had gotten in touch with him.
Yes.
So you indicated then that, or you testified that on the 9th, the defendant came to your house, you gave him your cell phone number, and he told you he was going to go check on them in Fallbrook.
Yes.
When did you next hear from him?
Don't know exact dates.
Okay.
But I want to say Saturday, Mikey went down there.
Okay, prior to Mike going down there on Saturday, did the defendant call you at all about what he had discovered at the house?
Yes.
And to the best of your recollection, when do you think that was?
It was that same day.
Were you in Ventura yet?
No. Driving.
Okay. And what can you tell us about what was said during that conversation?
This is when we talked about moving the dog bowls, the food and the water, to see if someone was possibly taking care of the dogs and they were out of town.
And what did he tell you about that?
That he would do it, when you went down there with the food and the water, and then would check it later.
Did you hear from him later in reference to that?
Yes.
And I know this is probably a tough question, but do you remember when that was?
No.
And what was said during that conversation?
That the dog bowls were moved.
Okay, I want to talk more about the bodies. Joseph, one of the remains of one of the boys, there wasn't enough there to even determine how he was killed. How's that possible?
Well, if children's bones are not fully mature to the point where, say, for instance, they are quite as calcified and resilient as a full-on adult, so there would be, for instance, a higher probability of eroding of the structures that are left behind, particularly in the harsh desert climate that we're talking about. This is so horrible to talk about, but if we talk about scavenging animals, this sort of thing, the children's bones many times have kind of a spongy consistency to them, something that's very attractive to these animals. So you'll find them many times gone very early on, unless they're very well buried. And these graves were not terribly deep, Jesse.
No, they're
not
shallow.
terribly deep.
Yeah, it's pretty awful. It's really, really awful, Joseph. And now at least we have a trial right now where we might get some more answers, because for the longest time they disappeared and no one knew what happened to them. So now we're facing a trial for this man and seeing what we can learn. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll obviously have a lot more to discuss. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about the Mcstay family murder, a really brutal crime where Charles Merritt is charged in connection with the brutal slaying of these 4 individuals. And now we're just looking at testimony that you might have missed. We'll be back live in this trial next week, but let's recap where we are. In case you haven't seen it, we saw that the family's neighbor took the stand, Jennifer Mitchellly, to explain a little bit more about her observations, and this has been quite the case to understand not only what happened when the bodies were discovered, but in the time leading up to their disappearance, the travel plans of the Mcstay family. How did they end up in the Mojave Desert becomes a huge question that we seem to can't answer. So let's learn a little bit more from this witness, and we'll talk a little bit more about it.
When I saw them out on the front yard, and I don't remember when that was.
So when you were contacted by the police and they indicated to you that they wanted to talk to you about the video surveillance, did they give you any idea or indication of what was happening across the street?
Well, somehow I knew, but I don't remember how I knew.
Okay. So after you're contacted by law enforcement and asked about video surveillance, what did you do?
I looked through my video for hours because at that time we didn't have a date. So I was just looking at the whole thing all weekend and was able to find some things.
Were you given any type of a date range in terms of, hey, could you look for video between this date and this date, or what exactly, how far back did you go?
I don't remember if I was given dates, but I know that I looked through everything.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this case, Jonna. The idea that Merritt, if you read his background, he doesn't have the best background. I know he's had stints in prison, you know, for various charges, including burglary, petty theft, grand theft. This was back in the 1970s. He had this, he even floated the idea that Summer was poisoning Joseph at one point. I mean, there seems to be some odd behavior from the part of the defendant. What do you make of this?
Well, I don't know if it's merely attempts to say, hey, jury, look over here instead of over here. But the crux of this case and the crux of the defense is basically that it's a botched investigation by the police and that they don't have the right guy. So anything that the defense can throw up that makes the jury take their attention off him and onto something else goes along with the theory of defense.
Joseph, is this a botched investigation? I mean, what is the evidence that we have tying Merritt to the crime? I mean, do we have that kind of solid DNA? I know we talked about some of the tire tracks matching Merritt's truck, but I'm curious from your analysis of this case, what do we have forensically tying him to this crime?
Well, tire tracks ain't DNA, I'll tell you that much. You know, John had mentioned that, you know, they're putting forth this idea of a botched investigation. This case is a classic example of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. It's a multi-jurisdictional case, which when you're talking about these kind of vast distances in remote locations where you're going from a semi-urban environment to kind of a vacant environment, you know, the wires get crossed. In this particular case, there's a tremendous amount of miscommunication and lack of communication between jurisdictions. When this happens, you're already talking about a case that's highly complex to begin with, and you add that next layer of complexity onto it where the law enforcement officials are not talking. It creates a real uphill battle.
Yeah, we know, and just to go back to the forensics, right, so we know that his DNA might have been found in the Mcstay vehicle, but his DNA really wasn't found at the crime scene. Jonna, this isn't a simple prosecution as it may have been in the other cases that we're covering with Monell and Melanie Ian.
Oh, no, this is far afield of that. There really is no straight line from the crime scene to this defendant, which is good when you're defending somebody, right? Because that is the reasonable doubt that you are looking for at the end of the day. And because it's a circumstantial case and there's no real direct link yet, unless we're going to hear one, right now this case is favoring the defense.
And Joseph, do we know how they ended up in the Mojave Desert? I mean, do we have any idea of where they were killed and how they were transported?
Yeah, I mean, just scratching my head over it. You know, I've heard this. The one curious thing for me is I've heard about this storage building that has come up, and that's been kind of curious because that's an intermediate stop along the way. If the bodies were in fact removed to that location, held there for a period of time, and then taken to the Mojave Desert after some head scratching, I just don't know how long all of this took. And that's where, you know, these cell phone records come into play. We've got, you know, the police have done kind of a pretty good job, a patchwork job of tracking this guy to a certain extent. But because of the lack of communication, the timeline gets all wonky. So it's hard to kind of pair this up and match it up to real time.
Yeah, and John, I got to ask you, last question, we only have under a minute. What do you expect for the upcoming week in this trial? We've seen quite some testimony this week.
You know, well, the prosecution laid out that he's trying to put forth the what, when, where, why, and how, right, of this case. And right now, I think where the defense is going to eventually go is they only concentrated on this particular person. It could have been somebody else. It most likely was somebody else, what we call the some other dude did it defense. I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming up in the future.
All right, we'll have to see. We'll cover this trial next week. Joseph Scott Morgan, thanks so much for coming on. All right, we can't wait to have you back. When we come back, though, we're going to be interviewing R. Kelly's attorney. We'll be right back.